welcome back to another reaction video. Today we're finishing off the two-part series on the HMS Victory by Epic History TV. So without further ado, let's get going.
HMS Victory, one of Britain's most powerful warships, in an age when Britain dominated the seas.
And I would say this domination lasted pretty much up to maybe World War II. Then the US shipbuilding program got off to a flying start for some reason. Some war or something, not entirely sure what that's about.
During the Napoleonic Wars, such ships were Britain's wooden walls, protecting the homeland from invasion, while devastating enemy commerce and protecting Allied shipping. Ships of the line were the largest and most sophisticated war machines of the conflict. Britain had around 140 in total, more than any other nation. But her advantage came less from number.
And 140 ships of the line were quite a bit more than the next biggest navy, which was France. And during the Napoleonic Wars, France had about 80 ships of the line. So yeah, almost double the amount.
Numbers, or better ship design, than the qualities of the men who sailed them. Bold and experienced commanders, disciplined and eager crews, all full of confidence and accustomed to victory.
Sounds like anyone you know? It sounds very much like Napoleon's Grande Armée during the early years of the Napoleonic Wars. Confident and experienced commanders, experienced officers and soldiers. And the experience is something we really undervalue. It's not all about numbers. An experienced smaller army would often beat a larger, inexperienced army, as the land on war and on sea has proven again and again throughout history. So that's something we need to keep in mind sometimes. Caesar was, of course, a brilliant general. Pompey the Great was also a very brilliant general. But what made a difference in the end? Experienced troops. And it's the same on the oceans. Britain's crews are just that much better than anyone else at this point.
This video is sponsored by War Thunder range of what we love now, using the description. At the height of the Napoleonic Wars, around 145,000 men served in Britain's Royal Navy, a number comparable to European field armies.
Yeah, actually it is. Now, at their height, the field armies of Europe would obviously be larger than that. But it's comparable to what the armies of Europe were in the early years of the Napoleonic Wars. For example, for the invasion of Prussia in 1806, Napoleon had access to about 170,000 men. That's comparable to this number. It's really incredible how many men were employed in the Navy. It's much more than you could think.
Of the period. Ships of the line, like HMS Victory, required huge crews, not so much to sail her, as to man her heavy guns. At the Battle of Trafalgar in 1805, she had 820 men aboard, a little short of her full complement of 850. Just 15 of these men were commissioned officers, one admiral commanding the fleet, one captain in command of the ship, 9 naval lieutenants, and 4 Royal Marine officers. Then the senior warrant officers, including the ship's master in charge of navigation, the gunner, responsible for the ship's guns, small arms, powder and shot, the boatswain, responsible for sails and rigging, and who with his mates oversaw all work on deck. 2 ship's carpenters, responsible for keeping the ship afloat and making repairs, the purser, in charge of ship's provisions, a surgeon for the crew's physical welfare, and a chaplain for their spiritual.
Now, these have some similarities with the land armies of Europe at this time. Obviously, we don't have a ship's carpenter or anything like that, but we do have engineers that could build bridges and camps and stuff like that. We had land armies had a bunch of surgeons and doctors with it, and even chaplains. It was very common for armies, and this has been the case for millennia at this point, to have some sort of chaplain or priest accompanying the army. Usually the commanding officer or king had his own personal chaplain. So, all the needs are covered here, even the spiritual ones.
Victory also had 21 midshipmen. These were young cadet officers, some of whom began their naval careers at just 13.
Wow.
They served a 6-year apprenticeship at sea.
Yeah, and it's very common during the French Revolutionary period, especially. You see all of these very young people, 15, 14, 13 years old, joining the army in some capacity. Obviously, perhaps not as soldiers, but as assistants or something like that. And I guess it was no different at sea.
Learning seamanship, sail handling, navigation, mathematics and trigonometry. They'd then be qualified to sit the lieutenant's exam, a rigorous assessment by a board of naval captains. Further promotion to commander, then captain, would depend on merit and, crucially, social and political connections. The process could be hugely frustrating for those without influential friends.
Yeah, and this is not really that strange, really, for the era. And you see the same sort of thing on land, and I'm comparing to land often because that's what I know best. I know more about the land armies than I do about the naval warfare side of things. But it was the same sort of thing. You had many brilliant officers serving in the French army, many brilliant generals, but only a very few made it to the very top, thanks to social connections. Not nobility, of course, in the case of France, but for example, Napoleon, he had connections to Augustin Robespierre, the brother of Maximilian Robespierre, and all of his marshals, of course, met Napoleon along the way, and in that case were able to advance to a higher rank. And it's even today, when you're looking for a job, having social connections does matter, even though it's not formally a requirement.
As satirized in this cartoon by the famous illustrator George Cruikshank. Some naval officers came from aristocratic families, but most were from what today we'd call the middle classes.
Interesting.
HMS Victory carried 43 clerks, orderlies, stewards and servants to assist the officers. 69
Yeah, I want to talk about the clerks. People underestimate the amount of administration that went into running an army or a navy at this time, and even today, of course, even more so. But there were usually, especially if it was the admiral's flagship, you had a bunch of clerks that assisted in the administration of the fleet. And they performed a very valuable and extremely important duty behind the scenes, and they rarely, if ever, get any credit at all in the history books. And so, shout outs to all the bureaucrats out there.
Junior warrant officers, petty officers, and their mates held various specialist roles, such as coxswain, armourer, and sailmaker. There were 212 able seamen, the veteran sailors, 193 ordinary seamen with at least a year's service, 87 landsmen, mostly new recruits, only good for hauling on ropes, 142 Royal Marine non-commissioned officers and privates, soldiers who fought at sea, led amphibious landings, and enforced discipline.
And of course, today, the Royal Marines and the US Marines are among the most prestigious units within the Navy still today. And they perform very complex and specialist tasks. And fighting at sea was no walk in the park. It was a bit different compared to fighting on land, where things were, it was relatively simple for this era. You lined up with your regiment and then you fired at each other. 2 line regiments fired at each other. It was easy that way. But here you had to perform boardings, for example, and all that sort of stuff.
And 31 ship's boys, many of them orphans plucked from destitution, now destined for a life at sea. Each man was assigned a station for every maneuver. Top men were the fittest, bravest sailors who handled the sails high above deck. Forecastle men were knowledgeable veterans who handled anchors and bowsprit sails. The waisters in the ship's waist and afterguard on the quarterdeck and poop were for hauling on ropes. The crew was organized into 2 halves, the larboard watch and starboard watch. They took turns on and off duty, except for emergencies when all hands were called on deck. They were further organized into divisions, each commanded by a lieutenant responsible for his men's welfare and conduct.
Started to look very similar to the structure of a land-based military organization. You have divisions, you have your non-commissioned officers, your junior officers, petty officers, and the generals, or the captain, or the admiral in this case. So, it's a very structured and organized, and it had to be if you had to run such a complex war machine that HMS Victory was. And, credit to them for coming up with this very rationalized system for a division of labor.
HMS Victory's crew, like that of most British warships, was surprisingly cosmopolitan. Most were from Britain and Ireland, but about 10% were foreigners.
Hey, look, we got 4 people from Sweden. Shout out to them, my countrymen.
Including Americans, Italians, Dutch, Maltese, and West Indians. About half were volunteers. The rest had been impressed, meaning they'd been forced into military service by the Navy's notorious press gangs.
Yeah.
These naval recruitment parties scoured ports and passing ships for British sailors, all of whom were considered fair game for compulsory enlistment.
Yes, and of course we have impressment for the Navy, we have conscriptions for the Army, though conscription seems to be more organized and formalized than these press gangs scouring harbors and just plucking people off the street. I don't really think that's how conscription went, most of the time anyways.
The process was not always entirely peaceful.
I can imagine.
Navy press gangs were feared and despised by civilians. They were known to seize men who were not sailors or even British, though most were later released if they could prove their identity. And there were limits. Contrary to popular myth, the Navy did not press vagrants, nor did it accept criminals convicted of serious crimes.
That makes sense. You do a ship of this size is really a small town or community, and you don't want elements in that community that could disrupt the social balance. And having criminals and vagrants on board doesn't sound like a good idea in any case. Sailing a ship, I know nothing about that.
To get the best out of a ship like Victory, the captain had to know his crew and his ship. Every vessel has its own best point of sailing relative to the wind. HMS Victory's was 1 or 2 points off her stern. This means she made her best speed, around 10 knots, sailing in these directions. But large ships do not sail in a straight line.
You know, this is a wind-powered ship and it's going 10 knots. That's amazing to me. But even today, when you see these huge aircraft carriers, especially the American ones, they have formally a top speed of maybe 30 knots, but they also have a classified speed and it probably goes way further than 30 knots. I think I might be wrong on those numbers, by the way, so, you know, leave a comment if I'm wrong. But I think it's about 30 knots. But, yeah. But doing 10 knots, a ship this size, with only sails? Amazing.
Due to leeway, the effect of the wind pushing the ship's hull sideways. This was something the helmsman steering the ship at the ship's wheel had to correct for.
Yeah, and these are manual corrections. I mean, you had to have a lot of experience, I imagine, to be able to effectively use the wind here to make sure the ship is being pushed in the right direction. Yeah, I can't imagine that had been an easy task.
The officer of the watch, usually a lieutenant, was responsible for the ship when on duty, and ordered which sails to set and take in. He would summon the captain if the situation required it. In strong winds, Victory might sail under topsails alone, perhaps with a jib and flying jib. In lighter winds, she would crowd on sail, adding courses, topgansels, and royals.
What a stirring sight it must have been to see Victory with all its sails crowded out. Wow. Looks amazing in this animation.
She might even run out the stunsail booms to set studding sails, pronounced stunsails. This was known as sailing large. But if the wind picked up, stunsails and royals had to be brought in quickly, as spars and sails could be damaged or torn away by a sudden strong gust. No sailing ship can sail directly into the wind. Victory's closest point of sail was 6 points off the wind. This was known as sailing close hauled or on a bowline. There were two methods of sailing against the wind. The first was tacking. This zigzag approach required precise sail handling and could strain spars and rigging. The alternative was wearing ship, an easier maneuver to perform, but slower, as it meant going the long way around.
Yeah, that seems quite inefficient.
Anchoring a large warship like Victory was also a complex operation. The sea's depth was discovered by casting the lead, literally throwing a lead weight tied to a rope into the sea. The rope clearly marked every fathom, or 6 feet. The preferred depth for anchoring was 40 fathoms or less, though it was possible in deeper water.
Come on, I don't need another unit of measurement. I have difficulty with the imperial system as it is. I prefer the rationalized metric system above all else, not these fathoms.
First, the ship reduced speed by taking in sail. When the ship came to a halt, the anchor was let go, with a marker buoy attached. As current and backed sails began to drive the ship sternwards, the anchor cable was run out, using 3 times the length needed to reach the sea bottom.
I mean, if the preferred depth is 73 meters, I mean, the amount of... and you have to run it out 3 times as much as needed. That's quite a lot of chain. I mean, damn. That's gotta be real heavy.
It was the weight of this giant cable, as much as the anchor, that kept the ship...
Ah. So it's not a chain cable, it's just a normal rope cable. Well, it looks pretty sturdy though. But damn, that is a pretty big rope. Or cable, I think would be more appropriate.
in position. Depending on weather, tide, and sea bottom, it might be necessary to set several of Victory's anchors to keep the ship safely moored.
There's a lot of anchors.
A less well-known inshore maneuver was kedging. This was a way to drag the ship against wind or tide using manpower alone. The lighter kedge anchor was carried in a ship's boat, rowed out ahead of the ship, and let go. The crew then turned the capstan to haul the ship towards the anchor.
Simple, but ingenious.
This exhausting process was repeated as many times as necessary to move the ship into position.
I mean, HMS Victory, a ship of this size, couldn't have been... I mean, it must have weighed a whole lot. Just... what they're basically doing is just forcibly pulling it forward. I mean, that's gotta be really tiresome. Can't imagine the manual labor that entailed.
Another version of this was warping, in which ropes were attached to a fixed object, like a strong tree on shore, and the ship hauled towards it.
The hotter the war, the sooner the peace. Actually, that makes sense. Most of the time, anyway.
In naval combat, the first consideration was always the direction and strength of the wind. A ship upwind or to windward had the advantage and was said to have the weather gauge. She could choose if and when to initiate battle, while the ship to leeward had to struggle into the wind to reach her adversary. Ships of all nations sometimes flew a false flag, that of another nation, to hide their identity. This was considered fair practice, but to fire on an enemy without first hoisting your true colors was an unpardonable crime.
That's sort of the medieval chivalry and honor system still being in effect, with some loopholes. I mean, it's okay to fly with a false flag, but if you fired without hoisting your real flag, now that is a dishonorable crime of all proportions.
When about to engage the enemy, the captain would order, "Beat to quarters." To the rattle of the Marines' drums, the ship was cleared for action. All temporary cabins on gun decks were dismantled and taken to the hold, so gun crews could work without obstruction. The sick bay was cleared away and all its patients carried down to the orlop deck. The galley stove was put out to reduce the risk of fire.
I mean, just clearing all of the partitions and moving them down into a hole. I mean, that's a lot of paneling that needs to be removed. and a lot of patience probably to be carried down several decks. Very impressive that they could probably do this in a few minutes.
And ammunition was moved up from the magazines to the gun decks. The ship's boats were launched and towed behind the ship. Here they were less likely to be smashed to splinters by enemy fire, and were immediately ready for any emergency.
That makes sense.
Sand was poured on the deck for traction, while splinter netting was put up above the decks to protect men from any falling spars or pulleys shot down by enemy fire.
They really thought of everything here.
Every man then took up his station for battle. Captain and officers in full uniform on the quarterdeck. Top men aloft, ready to trim sail. Sharpshooters on the fighting tops. Carpenter's crew on the orlop deck, ready to plug holes below the waterline. Gunner's mates in the magazine, filling extra cartridges. The surgeon in the cockpit, ready to receive casualties. For 3/4 of the crew, battle stations meant the gun decks, manning one of the ship's 104 guns. It was a huge amount of firepower for the age.
Oh yeah,
and made her
definitely
one of the most heavily armed warships in the world. Her heaviest cannon were the 32-pounders of the lower gun deck. At point-blank range, these guns could punch through 2 feet of solid oak.
Wow.
Heavy breaching ropes held each gun in place. Otherwise, recoil would have sent 4 tons of gun and carriage flying across the deck after every shot.
You're telling me these cannons weigh 4 tons? Jesus. That's like, what, 4 cars on average? An average car is 1 ton. So, damn, that's a heavy, heavy cannon. I mean, it is a 32-pounder, but still. Good thing they thought of the recoil, though. Wouldn't want that getting smashed into me.
Each gun had a crew of between 10 and 14, which was divided in half if the ship needed to fire on both sides. Each crew was led by a gun captain. He was responsible for aiming the gun, his crew shifting its massive weight with handspikes, crowbars, and wedges. When he was on target, the gun captain either applied a slow match to the touch hole, or, as seen here, pulled a lanyard attached to a gun lock to fire the gun. To reload, one man first blocked the vent with his thumb or a stopper to prevent sparks getting into the barrel during loading. The barrel was then sponged to extinguish embers and wormed to remove debris. A gunpowder cartridge was inserted at the muzzle and rammed home with a ramrod, followed by the shot, and then a wad to keep everything in place. The gun was run out into firing position and a pricker inserted into the vent to prick the cartridge and spill the gunpowder. The gun captain then added powder from his powder horn to the vent and priming pan. The gun was now primed, ready to fire again. This process took an experienced British gun crew around 90 seconds.
Very, very impressive. There's a lot of steps. Although the cannon itself, the firing mechanism and everything, it's pretty simple. There's a lot of steps involved in clearing debris and stuff like that. So 90 seconds is very impressive. And I'm sure all of these steps were required for artillery on land. The process should be fairly similar. I could be wrong. Someone might know in the comments. But yeah, like I said, good on them.
And they were generally faster and more accurate than their adversaries. As a battle wore on, the firing rate would fall dramatically due to exhaustion and casualties.
Oh yeah.
Conditions on a gun deck during battle must have been horrendous. Noise, smoke, sweat, and gruesome wounds caused by shot, flying wooden splinters, and accidents. Battles usually began with a broadside, a ship firing all guns on one side in quick succession. For greater impact, the first broadside could be double-shotted, every gun loaded with 2 rounds.
What? You could do
To
that?
guarantee penetration of an enemy ship's hull, the range should be less than 500 yards. Many captains preferred extreme close range to fight yardarm to yardarm.
Ooh.
The deadliest maneuver was to rake the enemy.
Yeah,
To
raking.
fire a broadside into their stem or stern.
I would like to hear more about, different types of ammunition. I think we'll hopefully cover it.
Round shot would smash its way the length of the ship, dealing death and mayhem as it went. French ships tended to fire high, on the uproll, aiming for masts and rigging to immobilize the enemy.
Okay.
British ships aimed low, for the hull, trying to knock out guns and crew.
I mean, there's nothing wrong in their priorities here. The question is, what is most efficient? I don't know the answer to that. But if you do manage to immobilize a ship, they're basically sitting ducks and pretty much won the battle at this point. But then again, I imagine it would be harder to shoot at the rigging rather than the hull. So that way you would immobilize their firepower instead. So yeah, I don't know. I'm sure there's an answer out there.
At long range, a mile or more, round shot could be skipped across the sea.
No
like
way.
skimming pebbles across a pond.
Really? You could do that?
Round shot, a solid iron ball, was the most commonly used type of ammunition.
Ah, there we go. But still, skipping a cannonball on the water, like skipping stones. I don't know the physics behind that, but wow, imagine landing a hit by skipping a cannonball. That's definitely something that could not be done on land. Well, the cannonballs would skip, but not in this way.
Specialist ammunition, such as bar shot, also
There we
known
go.
as double-headed shot or chain shot, was used to target masts and rigging.
There we go.
At close range, grape shot and canister, both packed with multiple smaller projectiles, turned a gun or carronade into a giant shotgun and were used to wreak havoc on an enemy deck.
Grape shot had a very poor accuracy, and you really needed to be right up close in order to have any chance of hitting the target. But grape shot were, without a question, the most devastating type of shot you could use in a cannon of this era. Giant shotguns would just mow down crews and men. And we've seen this in the Napoleonic War series, several encounters where grape shot has had a devastating impact. I just did the Eylau yesterday, so don't want to get hit by that.
A captain might decide to finish the fight by boarding an enemy warship.
Yeah,
Designated boarders armed themselves with muskets, pistols, cutlasses, and half-pikes.
this was the Roman way of doing things. They couldn't fight on the seas for, well, frankly, they were terrible at it, but they were good at land, so they turned every sea battle into a land battle by boarding the enemy and just overwhelming them with legionnaires. And yeah, I guess boardings were a bit more uncommon this era of history. I know pirates did it a lot, but I don't know if this was done a lot when two conventional powers were fighting each other.
The enemy ship was bound tight by grappling hooks, and after a shower of grenados and stink pots, an early form of tear gas, the boarders would swarm across to the enemy deck. In such actions, morale, aggression, and momentum counted more than tactics.
Oh yeah.
Though brutal, such battles were usually over quickly.
Sounds like bayonet charges, to be honest. All hands ahoy! Traditional wake-up call of the bosun's mates.
Combat at sea was relatively rare. Great fleet actions, such as Trafalgar and the Nile, were rarer still. Just a handful of days, spread across 20 years of war.
Oh yeah, fleet combat was unusual at best, but great fleet actions such as Trafalgar, where you have 10, 15, 20 ships on both sides, those were extremely rare. And yeah, I imagine most of it were just spent rolling your thumbs, basically, waiting for stuff to happen, patrolling the seas.
Weeks and months often lay between any encounter with the enemy. Then life at sea was dominated by naval routine, and the passage of time marked by the ship's bell. The naval day began at noon, determined by the officers' observation of the sun with their sextants. The moment the sun reached its highest point was noon. The ship's hourglass was turned, and the bell rung 8 times to mark the beginning of the afternoon watch. Half an hour later, as determined by a half-hour sandglass, the bell was rung once.
Yeah. Now that I think about it, they couldn't have any clocks because you're constantly moving about, and I'm sure shifting. Well, they didn't have time zones back then, but time zones is an artificial creation, but you know what I mean. The sun would rise earlier or later, depending on where you were in the world. And so you had to determine noon by the use of a sextant, wherever you were. So that's pretty... and you have this system where you ring the bells and turn an hourglass to keep watch of the time. That's pretty ingenious, actually.
A half hour later, it was rung twice, and so on. So 5 bells in the afternoon watch was 2:30 p.m. 8 bells meant the start of a new watch, sending half the crew below deck to rest or do other tasks, and bringing the other half on duty. There were 7 watches in all, though the first and second dog watches were only 2 hours long. This meant the 2 halves of the crew switched their routine each day, and one half wasn't always stuck with the same night watches.
Yeah, I can imagine that is very important for the mental well-being of the crew. I mean, you gotta have some routine, of course, but if you do the same routine over and over and over and over again, I imagine you probably go insane.
Senior officers slept in a hanging cot. For everyone else, bed was a hammock strung up from the ship's beams. Most of the men slept on the middle or lower gun decks, their hammocks suspended between the guns, just 16 inches apart. But as most ships operated a 2-watch system, half the crew on duty while the other half slept, about half the hammocks were empty at any given time.
Good, at least they don't have to all crowd in there at the same time.
In normal conditions, only part of the watch was required to sail the ship. The rest carried out various tasks, not least cleaning the ship, scrubbing decks, polishing brass, and painting woodwork.
Oh, that's gotta be painstaking work. I mean, a ship of this size, cleaning's gotta be hell.
This was a matter of maintenance and hygiene, as well as collective pride in their ship's appearance. The crew were fed 3 times daily, though only dinner at noon was a hot meal. They organized themselves into messes of about 8 men, each taking his turn to fetch cooked food from the galley, which was eaten at a table suspended between the guns.
Convenient.
Naval food wasn't fancy, but it was sufficient, even for men engaged in long hours of hard labor.
Let's take a look. Ship's biscuit, beef, pork, peas, oatmeal, butter, cheese. I mean, it isn't the most glorious menu I've sampled, but it will probably do the job. He's probably correct there.
Apart from the
They
ship's
weren't starving,
substantial
at least.
stores of salted beef, pork and ship's biscuit, the ship took on fresh meat, including livestock, fresh vegetables and water, at every possible opportunity.
Yeah, eating that menu every time. That salted food, salt and preserved food, must have been boring after a while. So, you know, every now and then, maybe they can spice it up with some fresh ingredients and vegetables.
Most of the crew probably ate better at sea than they would have in civilian life.
Probably.
As well as the daily routine dictated by the ship's bell.
I mean, they have all the stores they need with them when they set out on their journey. So they would always have access to some sort of food and water. And that was not always the case with land armies. Supply lines could be cut. Supply lines could be hindered in many ways. Bad roads and stuff like that. And as we seen with the invasion of Russia, for example, yeah, supplies were not a guarantee if you were a soldier in the army. And you had to resort to some pretty desperate measures at times. But if you are on a ship, you have all your stores a few decks down. And if you can spice it up with some fresh ingredients every now and again, when you lay in a port, that would be nice too. So, yeah, they probably ate better. Especially if you were a civilian from a poor background. This was probably a luxury too.
Well, there were weekly rituals. Clothes and hammocks washed and hung out to dry once a week, weather permitting. Gunnery practice by divisions. And on Sundays, a church service led by the ship's chaplain, if there was one, or the captain. This was followed at least once a month by a public reading of the Articles of War, the regulations that governed conduct and discipline at sea. The articles listed 36 offences, from drunkenness to theft, mutiny, cowardice and striking an officer. Half of these were punishable by death. In several cases, it was the only sentence allowed.
I mean, this makes sense, and now punishment death is pretty harsh. And I'm sure the other punishments were not that nice either. But like I said before, this is a community, a small society, and you need rules and laws that govern behavior on the ship. Otherwise, anarchy will set in. And yeah, it makes sense to have these sort of rules and regulations.
British discipline at sea was notoriously severe. Crimes for which a sailor was not hanged would usually lead to a flogging with the cat o' nine tails.
Ouch.
Drunkenness was the most common offence, not unconnected to the Navy's daily allowance of a gallon of beer per man in home waters.
A gallon. A gallon of beer. That's a lot of beer for one man.
Or half a pint of rum or other spirits overseas.
Oh, rum.
This, mixed 4 parts water to 1 part spirits, with lemon or lime juice added to prevent scurvy, was the famous Navy grog.
Lovely.
Any man caught drunk or asleep on duty might get 12 lashes, delivered by a boatswain's mate in front of the assembled crew. Serious crimes, such as desertion, might result in 200 lashes or more.
Oof.
A punishment so severe, it sometimes killed the prisoner.
Oh yeah, if you get lashed 200 times, I mean, if you don't die of pain and all that involved, some of the wounds will probably get infected, and you'll die that way. So yeah, that's some pretty severe discipline. I'm not sure it was that severe. I mean, on land you had firing squads in the worst cases, so... but I don't think they had whipping in the army.
Some naval captains were ferocious tyrants, but most knew that harsh punishment was best used sparingly. British sailors did not expect an easy life, but did expect to be treated fairly and with dignity. If not, there could be trouble. In 1797, the Royal Navy experienced a large-scale mutiny at Spithead, affecting 16 ships of the line. It was effectively a strike for better pay, as sailors hadn't had a pay rise in more than a century.
Yeah, a little bit of collective bargaining going on here. Of course, there were no unions at this time. There wouldn't be any unions for some time. So this was, a sort of union action, at least, by striking. And I don't know how effective they were, maybe he'll tell us, but historically strikes have done pretty well in getting workers better pay and better conditions.
The mutiny was settled without violence, and the sailors largely got what they wanted.
Good. Good on them.
A second mutiny at the Nore made more radical demands, with some crews threatening to defect to France.
Oh no, you cannot do that. You cannot defect to the enemy. Yeah, that's a bit more serious.
This time, the authorities were determined to set an example, and hanged 29 ringleaders.
Yeah, that was sort of inevitable, I guess.
Despite hard discipline and service, the British Navy produced crews that were experienced and able, bound together by long service at sea. Men that bold commanders knew they could rely on. The British Navy, well-manned, well-resourced, and backed by a powerful economy, was able to secure complete naval dominance during the Napoleonic Wars. It would prove a crucial factor in Napoleon's defeat. HMS Victory, having played her part, was placed in the Naval Reserve at the end of the war. Narrowly escaping the breaker's yard, she became the flagship of the Port Admiral of Portsmouth on England's south coast, and later flagship of the Royal Navy's Commander-in-Chief. After a major refit, Victory began a new life as a museum ship, opening to the public in 1928. Today, she is undergoing another major conservation project to deal with the many challenges faced by a 250-year-old wooden sailing ship. It will ensure her survival far into the future.
Yeah, I have such huge respect for all the conservationists out there who make sure that these important historical relics and buildings are with us for many, many, many years to come, so that future generations may take part and learn something about our history and, I mean, physically touch our history. I think it's very important that we do everything we can to make sure that historical treasures like HMS Victory don't go lost, and that money shouldn't be an issue in these sort of cases, which unfortunately it often is. And yeah, so big credit to all the conservationists out there who do such a thankless task. but extremely important, I would argue. And unfortunately, there are so many cases of historical buildings, historical relics, like the Victory, that are scrapped for stupid reasons, like economy and stuff like that. So yeah, we gotta take care of these few pieces of history we still got left and ensure its survival into the future.
As a unique memorial to this dramatic age of naval warfare.
Absolutely.
Thank you to Royal Museums Greenwich for help in collating images for this video. Greenwich in southeast London has been at the centre of British naval history for centuries and is an essential visit for anyone with an interest in our maritime past. There you can visit the Royal Observatory, home of the Greenwich Meridian, the legendary clipper ship Cutty Sark, and the National Maritime Museum. Their galleries tell the story of Britain's long connection to the sea, a tale of exploration, empire, trade and military power. Among the many highlights of the collection, the uniform Vice Admiral Nelson was wearing when he was killed at the Battle of Trafalgar. If you love maritime history, make sure you make a visit next time you're in town. Thank you also to Jack Fine Art and the estate of Derek Gardner for permission to use his paintings in this series. You can view many more of his fantastic artworks via the links in the description.
Very, very fine
Thanks
paintings.
again to War Thunder for sponsoring this video.
Alright, we don't need to watch the sponsorship. Anyways, that is HMS Victory Part 2. If you have any recommendations of what to watch next, leave them in the comments. If you like this video, leave a like, subscribe, yada yada, you know the drill. And I'll see you guys next time. Bye.